Alright, so hey everyone. Today I want to take a look at the Deadzone bug for Halo Campaign Evolved. This is being demonstrated on the Xbox Series X in case it differs on other platforms. But basically, this bug applies an additional dead zone on top of seemingly both sticks, but it will be most clear with the camera. But we'll see otherwise that the controls for this game seem identical to Halo Reach, and if this bug is fixed, the controls will basically be Halo Reach on the MCC. But what we have here for movement is a 27.5% square dead zone with these notched corners. And these notched corners go into about 24%. And there are 24% axial dead zones across each axis, so if your stick is anywhere within these blue regions, you'll be moving in one of four directions, in this case perfectly forward, perfectly backward, perfectly to the right, and perfectly to the left. You only start seeing diagonal movement occur when you break out of both axis dead zones, represented by this green region. And movement may seem a little more obvious because very likely this is an overlaying dead zone on top of the normal dead zone. So Halo Reach had a rounded square dead zone with angular restriction, but slightly less than this. So diagonal movement is likely starting before then, but because of an overlying dead zone, it's not being expressed. But once you break out of this, you might see the little jitters off to the side. But once I break out of this axis dead zone, you get pretty notable and constant diagonal movement. I didn't test the movement curve. I might get to some of those formally once this is fixed. I did attempt to test the sprint threshold, but Halo Reach has a very blocky sprint threshold, so that's a kind of nightmare to test and draw, so I didn't draw it for this, but I will show the dot graph. Basically, it is sort of an arc at your fuller tilts with an angular threshold, and once you're in it, you can sprint, and once you fall out of it, you return to normal. So nothing too special. The threshold is very strange, but in practice you're going to be pushing your stick fully anyway, so it doesn't matter much there. But for the camera, this is the big thing, and we're only looking at the 0% dead zones to really demonstrate this issue. So basically, what you see here is a 26.5% axial dead zone, and you can see I had the dead zone set to 0, and if I make small movements, those are reflected in game. So there is a 0% dead zone being applied. However, this overlaying dead zone stops movement if it doesn't detect stick movement. So if I move the stick, you can see that the camera is moving, but if I stop it, it stops. And you only get constant movement when you break out of these axis dead zones. So constant movement, no movement. And this applies independently per axis. So I can bob around this vertical axis line, and you see that it is bobbing. So there is vertical movements occurring, but if I stop, you're seeing some jitter, vertical jitters occurring because the stick is wobbling a little bit. But generally, only horizontal movement is constant because I've broken out of the horizontal threshold, but the vertical threshold is still inconsistent. And if we cap the view like this, we can see the same thing vertically, how jittery this is while we're in this threshold, but once we break out of this, we have smooth, constant movement. And this is quite abrupt because we are functionally making a pretty dramatic angle and moving significantly horizontally. But if we move slowly here, it's moving when we move the stick, but not when it stops. This does functionally affect the acceleration curve. So again, when you're moving the stick, it registers okay. But once you move, you only start really getting constant movement after breaking out of this axial dead zone. So the acceleration curve is only really consistent past this point and sort of functionally crops this if you're making small movements. The Halo CE on the Master Chief Collection had a very similar bug. However, movement didn't disable it. It was just a flat axial threshold that was sitting right on top of the normal controls. But here, movement does trigger, but otherwise they were seemingly the exact same size. One way to mitigate this is to at least raise your axial dead zones so that they are equal to or larger than this dead zone. So the in-game options increase the dead zone so nothing's occurring even when moving, because even though moving would disable this overlying dead zone, the game dead zone is now in effect. However, increasing it does make it so that the curve aligns outside of this, so you can access your low speeds a little more reliably. However, this doesn't fix some of the lost diagonals. The maximum look axial dead zone is 20%, and you'd need it at 26.5% to formally counter this overlying axial dead zone. So at 20%, you're still losing some diagonal movement here. And let's just do this and look straight up again. You might see if I just ride this, there could be some jitter occurring. It needs to have horizontal movement. See that little slight jitter in the difference from 20% to the 26.5%. And then when you move over, it's a little less abrupt because the axial dead zone is pretty close, so you're not losing too much angles, versus if you set it to 0, then this is a pretty significant jump, but you're still losing some. So you can mitigate it by using larger dead zones, but of course the actual fix is to remove this overlying dead zone so that these options can actually work properly. Now, that should definitely be fixed, but there are some additional improvements that I'd like to see generally and largely that I made in Halo Infinite. So the first is the acceleration curve here. What we have here is Halo reaches controls, basically, without this glitched issue. And really the main difference with the curve compared to the classic Halo games is the curve itself is actually the same shape as them. However, the jump in acceleration, Halo Reach and onward, has capped the sensitivity to 360 degrees per second, and that in the acceleration jump after about default sensitivity can't be fully expressed, whereas in the classic games you could have a maximum of like 640 degrees, whatever. So that's much faster, and the acceleration jump is always fully expressed. Here, when you're playing at max sensitivity, you actually don't get much of a jump. But if we lower the sensitivity, the jump can be fully expressed. And you can see that quite clearly here. So one of the other things would be removing that sensitivity cap so the acceleration jump can always be fully expressed. We also have an option for look acceleration. However, this only controls how long it takes to reach that acceleration jump max. So there's always about a 3 times increase. And it'd be nice for another option to control the actual multiplier for the look acceleration so that you could disable it or control the intensity of it. So if you set it to 1 times, you wouldn't have any additional look acceleration. If you set it to 3, it'd be the default, and then you could choose something in between. Another thing is, it's a little difficult to see on this graph, and I actually might lower the sensitivities to attempt to demonstrate this, but the vertical and horizontal accelerations are different. So the threshold for horizontal acceleration is right around here. So the more horizontal shaded region increases your horizontal speed, and we'll aim down to really make this clear. The acceleration jump isn't as noticeable vertically, but they do register separately, and that has an effect on your diagonal movement. When you accelerate, only accelerating the horizontal axis makes your angles bias horizontally, and only accelerating vertically makes your angles bias vertically. It's a little difficult to demonstrate that, but that is what's happening. And there is a very slight overlap between the two, and when both axes are accelerating at the same time, then your diagonal movement isn't affected. And that's an option that I'd like to request, is having a unified threshold. So whenever you break outside of your acceleration threshold, it accelerates both axes at the same time. Splitgate actually has an option for this. Their axial acceleration functions like Halo does currently, but their radial one accelerates both axes at the same time. So that's something I'd like to see here. Very similarly, the vertical sensitivity slider is weighted lower than the horizontal, and it seems that the vertical sensitivity is about 60% of the horizontal at the same values. And that's a little unintuitive. If you want them the same, you actually have to set the horizontal sensitivity lower than the vertical. But having different axis sensitivities also skews your diagonal movement towards the more sensitive axis. So it's not dramatic enough to be super clear at the same values. If I move at 45 degrees, it actually is skewed a little more horizontally. But this is more obvious when looking at the extremes. And moving 45 degrees, and the camera is very flat in comparison. And the opposite extreme, (45 degrees), is now vertically biased because the vertical sensitivity is exceeding the horizontal. So the fix for this would just be making the vertical sensitivity slider equal to the horizontal, so that if you set them the same, they are the same, and if you want a specific ratio or higher or lower sensitivities, you can set them that way yourself. And if you have them the same, then you get correct diagonal movement. There are different methods to have different axis sensitivities and still have correct diagonal movement, but most games do it this way, where the individual axes affect the angles if they're different. The last thing is aim assist. So Halo has always forced aim assist in their games, and at least with the Halo Anniversary as well as the Master Chief Collection, they've added a skull that allows you to disable aim assist. However, it disables all aim assists, so both the sticky aim, which is both the reticle slowdown when passing over a target, your sensitivity drops, and the tracking, so when strafing around a target or when they move in front of you, your camera will rotate to follow them some amount, as well as bullet magnetism, which has your bullets redirect towards an enemy within a certain range. And bullet magnetism is really the bigger of the issues. Many of the weapons in Halo sort of rely on that and become much less effective at even medium ranges because the bullet's spread becomes more significant without magnetism. And it would be nice to have dedicated options for it. The skull removing all aim assist is fine. That's a challenge thing, but having options for all three of them separately, I think would be ideal, so that players who say want just bolt magnetism but don't want sticky aim could use that. That's actually how Halo Combat Evolved on PC, at least with the default install, seemed to play. You had to, I think, upgrade to custom edition or do something to enable the sticky aim there. But also for players who don't like the camera moving but do want some of the slowdown, could do that with separate sliders for both the slowdown and adhesion aim. So the options for all three aim assist types, I think, should be added. And I think that about covers things. So this was pretty long-winded. The main thing is to fix this overlying Accel dead zone. Again, the issue is that the options in the game are accurate, but I'm still at a 0% dead zone, and while you're moving your stick, it is mitigated, but when it stops and you're within this dead zone, then it stops. So it's very inconsistent and eats both small movements and diagonal inputs. And this actually isn't corrected. I thought that maybe adding some jitter to your controller input would mitigate this, and if I do that, you can see that if I move the stick and hold it in place with some jitter, technically your stick is always moving. There is constant movement, but it's still super jittery. I wouldn't say it's constant because of that, but so even jittering the stick isn't a good solution for that. This just needs to be formally corrected. But this is the main thing to fix, but hopefully all those other things are addressed too, making the vertical sensitivity slider the same as the horizontal, unifying this acceleration jump, removing the acceleration or the speed cap, adding an option to control the level of the acceleration jump, adding aim assist options, and something I didn't add before, but having an option for the acceleration curve. Maybe this curve, if this curve plays well with exponents, it'd be nice to have a smooth slider to control the intensity of it, going from, say, a linear curve to what we have currently. But if the function they're using for the curve isn't smooth like that, just having a few different presets would also work. So I think that, one, this will both greatly improve the game simply by removing this overlying axial dead zone, but adding those additional things would improve the rest of it. But that's a lot of rambling, and that hopefully covers things. So thanks for watching, and everyone, have a great rest of your day.